The Ashworth dining room held 8 guests beneath the glow of 40 candles, and between the third and fourth courses, Catherine Vane leaned toward Lady Bracewell and said, with perfect graciousness, that the Sèvres service was reserved for formal occasions. They had always used the Wedgwood for intimate dinners. Eleanora heard the word "we" and felt it land like a stone in still water. But Edmund did not pause in his conversation with the Venetian ambassador, did not glance toward his cousin, did not seem to register that Catherine had just claimed ownership of his household in front of witnesses. That night, alone in the dressing room, Eleanora pulled back the counterpane to check that the bed had been turned correctly, a habit she had developed over 11 months of fighting a house that refused her instructions, and found, tucked beneath Edmund's pillow, a pearl drop earring with a Venetian setting that did not belong to her. She stood holding it for a full minute before she moved. The metal was still faintly warm from the linen. She crossed to the vanity and set it down beside her own earrings, a careful row. Hers, hers, not hers. She sat, removed her necklace, unpinned her hair, and picked up the brush. The motion was automatic, mechanical. Long strokes from crown to ends, the boar bristle dragging through the weight of dark hair she had worn pinned all evening. Her reflection stared back at her. Composed, steady, a woman who had learned at 21 that evidence mattered more than declarations. The door opened behind her. Edmund's reflection appeared in the glass, his cravat already loosened, his face open and easy in the way it always was when they were alone. He smiled at her in the mirror. "Catherine was in fine form tonight," he said, reaching to unfasten his cuff. "I think the ambassador's wife was charmed." Eleanora did not stop brushing. Her voice, when it came, was calm and precise. "I found her earring in our bed." The brush continued its rhythm. 1 stroke, 2, 3. Edmund's hand froze at his throat, his fingers still gripping the knot of his cravat. His eyes met hers in the mirror, and for 3 seconds neither of them moved. "Whose?" he asked. She turned in her chair, holding the earring between them. The candlelight caught the pearl, turned it luminous and cold. "I was hoping you would tell me." He stared at the earring, then at her face. His expression was not guilt. It was bewilderment, pure and unguarded, the look of a man who did not understand what was happening. "I do not know whose it is," he said. That is what Lionel said, about the perfume. The name landed between them like a blade. Edmund's face changed, not closing, but fracturing. He understood now. This was not about an earring. This was about whether she would ever believe a man again. "Eleanora," he said quietly, "I am not Lionel." "I know you are not Lionel," she replied. "But I knew Lionel was not Lionel until I found the receipt for the lodging house and the bottle of scent that was not mine. I do not trust declarations, Edmund. I trust evidence. And the evidence is on my vanity." She stood, crossed to the wardrobe, and took down her traveling case. She opened it on the bed and began packing with the same precision she applied to everything. 3 dresses folded flat, a nightgown, stockings, her comb. She reached into the drawer of her writing desk and withdrew a small magnifying glass, the one her father had used to examine documents when he served as magistrate. She packed it the way other women packed smelling salts. Edmund had not moved from the doorway. He stood with one hand still at his throat, his face devastated in a way she had never seen. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To my mother's house. When you can explain this earring, you may call on me there." "Eleanora, look at my face." She stopped, turned, looked, His face was open, completely undefended. A man who did not know how to lie because he had never needed to learn. His eyes held hers without flinching, without calculation, without the smooth performance she remembered from Lionel's denials. She wavered. For 3 full seconds, her certainty cracked. She saw the man she had married, the man who had found her precision attractive instead of frightening, who had kissed her hand at a concert and said he admired a woman who catalogued depositions during an overture, the man whose first words to her had been about the ink stain on her thumb. Then she picked up the earring, dropped it into her reticule, and closed the traveling case. "I will be at my mother's," she said again. She walked past him, out of the dressing room, down the stairs, and into the night. She chose evidence over his face. That was her first mistake. He would spend the next 9 days discovering his. The morning light came cold through the bedroom windows. Edmund had not slept. He had spent the night sitting in the chair by the fire, staring at the bed where his wife had found another woman's earring, trying to construct an explanation that made sense. At dawn he stood, crossed to the bed, and began searching. He pulled back the counterpane, examined the pillows, ran his hands along the mattress seams. He checked the floor beneath the bed, the surface of the nightstands, the windowsill. He found nothing. No second earring, no note, no trace of whoever had been in this room. He rang for Mrs. Garrick. The housekeeper arrived within minutes, her face carefully neutral. She had been with the household for 12 years, had served his mother through her final illness, and had never once failed in her duties. "Mrs. Garrick," Edmund said, "who had access to this room yesterday?" "Only Mary, Your Grace, and Mrs. Vane." Edmund's mind, still fogged with sleeplessness, did not register the significance of the second name. "Mrs. Vane supervised the linen change?" "Yes, Your Grace, as she always does." Something flickered in Mrs. Garrick's eyes, a hesitation, a tension around her mouth. But she said nothing further. Edmund dismissed her and returned to staring at the bed. Catherine had been in this room. Catherine, who had managed this household for 6 years. Catherine, who knew every servant, every routine, every corner of Ashworth House. But Catherine had no reason to place an earring in his bed. She had welcomed Eleanora with perfect graciousness, had offered to help with the household transition, had been nothing but accommodating. He could not make the pieces fit. So he did what he had always done when faced with problems he could not solve. He decided to handle it himself, quietly, without troubling anyone. He did not yet understand that this was exactly the instinct that had allowed his marriage to be dismantled. At Lady Sinclair's house in Mayfair, Eleanora sat in the morning room with her mother and told her about the earring. Lady Sinclair listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her face grave. When Eleanora finished, Lady Sinclair was silent for a long moment. "You found an earring," she said finally. "You packed a trunk. You came here. Have you considered that you are doing exactly what you did with Lionel? Investigating instead of asking?" "Asking Lionel would have given him time to construct a better lie," Eleanora said. "And this man? Did his face look like a liar's?" Eleanora was silent. She remembered Edmund's face in the mirror, the bewilderment, the devastation, the complete absence of calculation. "I do not know anymore," she said quietly. "That is the problem. I cannot tell the difference between a man who is innocent and a man who is skilled at deception. So you investigate." She nodded. "So I investigate." Lady Sinclair leaned forward. "Eleanora, you are my daughter, and I love your mind. I love that you see patterns where others see chaos. I love that you trust evidence. But evidence can only tell you what happened. It cannot tell you what it means. An earring in a bed is a fact. But the story around that fact, who placed it there and why, and whether your husband knew, that requires asking questions, not building cases. He said he did not know whose it was. Did you believe him? Eleanora looked down at her hands. The ink stain was still there on her thumb, dark and permanent. I wanted to, she whispered. That is not the same as did. She shook her head slowly. No, it is not. Lady Sinclair reached across and covered her daughter's hand with her own. Then stay here. Build your case if you must. But remember that Lionel taught you to see betrayal. Do not let him teach you to see it where it does not exist. 3 days passed before Edmund came to Lady Sinclair's house. When he arrived, he did not ask to see Eleanora privately. He asked for both women, and when they joined him in the drawing room, he did not sit. I have examined the household accounts, he said without preamble. The linen records, the staff schedule. Catherine supervised the linen change in our bedroom 2 days ago. She was the only person besides Mary who had access to that room. Eleanora felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, but a different kind of tension. Catherine has been in your household for 6 years, she said carefully. She has no reason to place an earring in our bed. I do not know her reasons, Edmund replied, but I know who was in the room. He met her eyes directly, and she saw something new in his face. Not defensiveness, not pleading, but a kind of grim determination. He was not asking her to believe his innocence. He was showing her evidence of his own. I am continuing to investigate, he said. I will bring you answers, not declarations. He left without asking her to return home. Eleanora sat in the drawing room after he had gone, staring at the place where he had stood. That, Lady Sinclair said quietly, was not the behavior of a guilty man. She agreed softly. No, it was not. But she still did not return to Ashworth House. She was not yet ready to trust what she had seen in his face. Edmund returned to Ashworth House and went directly below stairs. He found Mrs. Garrick in the housekeeper's room, reviewing the week's menus. She stood when he entered, her face carefully composed. Mrs. Garrick, he said, my wife told me for months that her instructions were not being followed, that correspondence was delayed, that Mary was reassigned without her knowledge. I spoke to you about it. You told me everything was in order. Was it? Mrs. Garrick's composure wavered. Her hands tightened on the menu book. Mrs. Vane told me the Duchess preferred afternoon post, she said finally. She told me her Grace wanted Mary moved to the East Wing. She told me the kitchen instructions had been amended. I followed Mrs. Vane's directions because she managed this house for 6 years, and I did not question her authority. Edmund felt something cold settle in his stomach. You followed Catherine's directions over my wife's. She nodded reluctantly. Yes, Your Grace. For how long? Mrs. Garrick looked down at the menu book in her hands. Since the 1st month of your marriage. 11 months. 11 months of Eleanora telling him something was wrong, and he had smiled and said he would handle it. And then he had spoken to Mrs. Garrick, who had spoken to Catherine, who had continued the campaign without interruption. Why did you not tell me? He asked. Mrs. Vane said the Duchess was still adjusting, that she did not yet understand how the household ran, that it was better to maintain consistency until her Grace felt more settled. Mrs. Garrick's voice was barely above a whisper. I believed her, Your Grace. She kept this house running when your mother was dying. She knew every detail, every routine. I thought she was helping. Edmund stood in the housekeeper's room, surrounded by menus and linen inventories and duty rosters, and understood for the first time the architecture of his own failure. He had trusted the efficiency of his household without examining who was building that efficiency or at what cost. "Thank you, Mrs. Garrick," he said quietly. "That will be all." He went upstairs, called for his horse, and rode directly to Mayfair. When Edmund arrived at Lady Sinclair's house the second time, Eleanora received him alone. They sat in the morning room, on opposite sides of a low table, with 11 months of unexamined household friction between them. "Catherine has been countermanding your instructions for 11 months, Edmund said. Mrs. Garrick confirmed it. The delayed post, the reassigned maid, the kitchen orders that were never followed. All Catherine. Eleanora felt her breath catch. Not because she was surprised. She had felt the resistance for months. But because someone had finally confirmed that she was not imagining it. "That does not explain the earring," she said. "No," Edmund agreed, "but it explains the pattern. And the earring is part of that pattern." He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "You were right that something was wrong in our house," he said. "You were wrong about what it was. I was wrong that everything was fine. You told me the house fought you. I told you I would handle it. I handed the problem to the woman who was building the fight." Eleanora looked at him across the table. His face was drawn, tired, but no longer bewildered. He had spent 4 days investigating his own household, and he had found what she had been trying to tell him since the first month of their marriage. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We find out why Catherine placed that earring in our bed," Edmund said. "Together." For the first time in 9 days, they sat side by side instead of across from each other. Edmund reached across the space between them and turned her hand palm up. He traced the ink stain on her thumb, the same stain from the concert, from the depositions, from every document she had examined, instead of asking a direct question. "You still have ink," he said. "I always have ink." He smiled faintly. "I know." He closed her hand over his finger and held it. She let him. The alliance had shifted. They were no longer accuser and accused. They were two people who had failed to see the same threat from different angles, and who were now facing it together. The next morning, Eleanora called on Catherine Vane. She arrived at Ashworth House unannounced, walked past the startled footman, and went directly to Catherine's sitting room on the second floor. Catherine was at her writing desk, composing correspondence. She looked up when Eleanora entered, and her face arranged itself into an expression of polite welcome. "Your Grace," Catherine said, standing. "I did not know you had returned." "I have not," Eleanora said. "I am visiting." She sat without waiting for an invitation. Catherine hesitated, then resumed her own seat. A tea tray arrived within minutes. Catherine's doing, Eleanora suspected. Everything in this house moved at Catherine's direction. "I wanted to ask you about the dinner party," Eleanora said, accepting a cup. "You corrected me about the Sèvres china in front of Lady Bracewell. You said, 'We have always used the Wedgwood for intimate dinners.'" "Who is we, Catherine?" Catherine's cup paused halfway to her lips. The pause lasted less than a second, but Eleanora saw it. "The household," Catherine said smoothly. "The household I manage." "Of course, Your Grace." Eleanora watched her face. This was the method she should have used from the start. Not documents, not receipts, not jeweler's records. Eyes, attention. Watching a human being for the fracture. Catherine's fracture was in the word we. It was possessive, territorial. a claim she could not quite release even when corrected. "I have been at my mother's house for 9 days," Eleanora said. "I imagine the household has run smoothly in my absence." "The household always runs smoothly," Catherine replied. "Yes, it does. Even when I am here, giving instructions that are not followed." Catherine set down her cup. Her face remained composed, but something shifted behind her eyes. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace." "I think you do." Eleanora stood. She had not come to confront Catherine, not yet. She had come to watch, to confirm what Edmund had discovered, to see the architecture with her own eyes. She had seen enough. That afternoon, Lady Bracewell called on Eleanora at Lady Sinclair's house. It was a social visit, ostensibly to inquire about Eleanora's health. They sat in the drawing room with tea and biscuits, and Lady Bracewell spoke of the weather, the theater, the latest gossip from the lending library. Then, as she was preparing to leave, she said casually, "Catherine told me you have been unwell. Nerves," she said. "I do hope you are feeling better." Eleanora set down her teacup very carefully. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have never been unwell." Lady Bracewell blinked. "Oh." She seemed quite concerned. She said the adjustment to the household had been difficult for you and that you needed rest. "Did she?" "Yes. At the lending library 3 days ago. She spoke to Mrs. Thornton and myself. She was very discreet, of course, but one could tell she was worried." Eleanora smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "How kind of her to be concerned," she said. After Lady Bracewell left, Eleanora sat alone in the drawing room and understood the full scope of what Catherine had built. Not just household sabotage, reputation management. Catherine had been telling the women of society that Eleanora was unwell, unstable, struggling to adjust, so that when the marriage fractured, as Catherine intended it to, the world would already have an explanation that absolved Edmund and pathologized Eleanora. It was methodical. It was patient. It was the work of a woman who had spent 6 years managing a household and knew exactly how to dismantle one. That evening, Edmund came to Lady Sinclair's house for the 3rd time. This time, Eleanora met him at the door. She told him what Lady Bracewell had said. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with every sentence. "She has been building a case against you," he said when she finished. "For 11 months. She confirmed it quietly. "Yes. And I gave her every tool she needed. I dismissed your concerns. I told you the household was fine. I let her speak for you to Mrs. Garrick, to the staff, to society. You did not know. I should have known. You told me something was wrong. I chose not to see it because seeing it would have required me to examine the household I had been ignoring for 6 years. They stood in the entrance hall of Lady Sinclair's house. 2 people who had been married for 11 months and were only now beginning to understand each other. "I'm staying here tonight," Eleanora said. "But tomorrow I am returning to Ashworth House." Edmund looked at her sharply. "Why?" "Because Catherine placed that earring in our bed, and I want to hear her say it. Not in a letter. Not through a confession extracted by you. I want to sit in the room where she put it and watch her face when you ask her directly if she did it. She may lie. Then I will see the lie. That is what I should have done with you 9 days ago, looked at your face and asked a question instead of building a case. I will not make that mistake again." Edmund reached across the space between them and pressed his palm flat against the door frame, blocking it without entering. "I will find out who put that earring in our bed," he said quietly. "And when I do, I will bring them to you. Not a letter, not a report. The person." He held the frame until she nodded. Then he stepped back and left. Eleanora stood in the entrance hall, her hand against the place where his had been, and felt the first stirring of something she had not allowed herself to feel in 9 days. Hope. The next night, Eleanora returned to Ashworth House. She did not go to the bedroom she shared with Edmund. She went to the guest room on the 3rd floor, the one she had used during her first week in the house, before the household had begun its campaign against her. She unpacked her traveling case, washed her face, and sat at the small writing desk by the window. Outside, the London streets were dark and quiet. Inside, the house creaked and settled around her, a living thing with its own rhythms and secrets. There was a knock at the door. She opened it. Edmund stood in the corridor, still dressed, his cravat loosened. He did not ask to come in. "I need you to know something before tomorrow," he said. "Whatever Catherine says, whatever her reasons, I failed you. Not because of the earring. Because you told me for 11 months that something was wrong, and I smiled and said I would handle it. And then I gave the problem back to the woman who was causing it." Eleanora leaned against the door frame. Edmund leaned against the opposite wall. The corridor between them was 4 feet of carpet and 11 months of unexamined household politics. She reached across the space and pressed her palm flat against his chest. She felt his heart beating, fast, unsteady, the rhythm of a man who was genuinely frightened. "You are afraid," she said. He answered simply, "Yes." "Good. Fear means you understand what you almost lost." She withdrew her hand and stepped back. She did not close the door immediately. For a moment they stood there, looking at each other across 4 feet of corridor that felt wider than the distance between Mayfair and Ashworth House. "Tomorrow," she said, "we will confront her together, in the dressing room. You will ask her directly if she placed the earring in our bed. I will watch her face. We will have Mrs. Garrick as witness. No documents presented first, no evidence laid out. Just a question and a face." Edmund nodded. "Agreed." Eleanora closed the door. She stood with her back against it, listening to his footsteps retreat down the corridor. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the writing desk, the magnifying glass beside her, and thought about all the things she had investigated and all the questions she had not asked. Tomorrow she would ask. The next morning, Edmund sent for Mrs. Garrick and instructed her to summon Catherine to the Duchess's dressing room at 11 o'clock. He did not explain why. Mrs. Garrick's face was pale, but she nodded and went to deliver the message. At 11:15, Eleanora entered the dressing room. She had not been in this room since the night she found the earring. It looked exactly as she had left it. The vanity with its mirror, the brush still lying on the glass surface, the bed with its counterpane pulled smooth. She sat at the vanity and picked up the brush. She did not use it. She simply held it, the weight familiar in her hand. Edmund entered at 11:05. He stood beside the vanity, his face grave. Mrs. Garrick arrived at 11 precisely and took her place near the door, her hands folded, her eyes on the floor. Catherine arrived last. She entered the dressing room with her usual composure, her face arranged in an expression of polite inquiry. She looked at Eleanora, then at Edmund, then at Mrs. Garrick. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in the arrangement. The Duchess at the vanity, the Duke standing, the housekeeper as witness. "You asked to see me, Your Grace," Catherine said. Edmund did not waste time on preamble. "Catherine," he said, "did you place an earring in our bed?" The question was direct, unadorned, impossible to deflect. Catherine's composure held for 4 seconds. Then her eyes moved, not to Edmund's face, not to Eleanora's, but to the bed, to the exact spot where the earring had lain beneath the pillow. The glance lasted less than a second, but it was enough. "I do not know what you mean," Catherine said. "Yes, you do," Edmund replied. "Mrs. Garrick has confirmed that you supervised the linen change in this room 9 days ago. You were alone in here for several minutes while Mary fetched fresh pillowcases. You had access. You had opportunity. I am asking you directly. Did you place an earring in this bed to make my wife believe I had been unfaithful?" Catherine's face changed. The composure cracked, and beneath it was something raw and exhausted. "You married a stranger," she said quietly, "and you asked me to hand her the keys to a house I built." "I am asking you a question," Edmund said. She answered with quiet finality. "Yes, I put it there." Mrs. Garrick's intake of breath was audible. Eleanora sat very still at the vanity, the brush motionless in her hand. Catherine continued, her voice steady now, stripped of performance. "I kept your mother alive in that bedroom for 2 years. I sat with her through the nights when she could not breathe. I know which floorboard creaks outside this door. I know which window sticks in the rain. I know where the spare candles are stored and which maid is reliable, and how to manage the household accounts so that you never had to think about them. She does not know any of that. She arrived 11 months ago, and you called her Duchess and expected me to teach her how to live in the house I held together while your mother was dying and you were riding in the park." Edmund's face was pale, but his voice was steady. "I did expect that," he said. "And I was wrong to expect it. I asked you to serve a woman I loved without asking what you felt. That was cruel, and I did not know it was cruel, which makes it worse." "It does," Catherine agreed. "But you put a forged earring in my wife's bed to make her believe I was unfaithful. You let her carry that fear for 9 days. You delayed her letters and reassigned her maid and told Mrs. Garrick she preferred afternoon post when she had said no such thing. You told Lady Bracewell she was unwell with nerves. You made her feel like an intruder in her own house." Catherine's voice was flat. "She is an intruder." Eleanora spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm, precise, the voice of a woman who had spent 9 days building a case and had finally found the defendant. "No," she said. "I am not. I was uncertain. I was new. I was learning a house that did not want to teach me. But I am not an intruder. I am the Duchess of Ashworth, and you will leave this house tomorrow." Catherine looked at Edmund. The exhaustion in her face deepened, became something closer to grief. "I loved you," she said. "You know that." "I know," Edmund said quietly. "And I should have said years ago that I did not love you that way. I let you believe because it was easier than speaking. That was the first wrong thing. Everything else grew from it." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked out of the dressing room. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady and unhurried. She did not look back. Mrs. Garrick curtsied and followed, closing the door behind her. Edmund and Eleanora were alone in the dressing room. She was still at the vanity, still holding the brush. He stood beside her, his reflection visible in the mirror. "You asked her directly," Eleanora said. He confirmed it. "Yes. I spent 9 days tracing jewelers and examining handwriting samples. You asked a question and watched her face. Your method would have worked. My method cost us 9 days. My method cost us 11 months, Edmund said. I did not see what she was doing. You felt it from the first week. You told me the house fought you. I said I would speak to Mrs. Garrick. You did speak to Mrs. Garrick. And nothing changed, and I did not ask why. I assumed a house that ran smoothly was a house where everyone was well. That is the same mistake. Trusting what looks efficient instead of listening to the person who said something was wrong. Eleanora set the brush down on the vanity. She turned to face him, no longer looking at his reflection, but at the man himself. "We are both wrong," she said. He agreed quietly. "Yes. I should have asked you about the earring instead of investigating you. I should have investigated the household instead of trusting Catherine." "So," Eleanora said slowly, "she was building a case against me, and I was building a case against you, and you were building nothing because you assumed everything was fine." That is an accurate summary. It is not flattering to either of us. She shook her head slightly. "No." Edmund crossed the space between them and stood in front of her. She looked up at him, and for the first time in 9 days, she let herself see his face without suspicion, without the weight of Lionel's betrayal coloring what she saw. He reached down and took her hands, pulling her to her feet. Then he kissed her. It was not rushed or desperate. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 9 days unable to touch the person he was accused of betraying, and a woman who had spent 9 days wanting to believe the face she refused to trust. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palm. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the pearl drop earring. He had retrieved it from her reticule while she was at her mother's house. Mrs. Garrick had found it and given it to him, thinking he would want to examine it. He held it out to her. She took it and walked to the fireplace. She held the earring over the grate, where it would fall into ash and be consumed. Then she stopped. She set it on the mantel instead. "I am keeping it," she said. Edmund looked at her, surprised. "Why?" "Because the next time I find something that frightens me, I want to remember that I spent 9 days proving what I could have learned in 9 seconds by looking at your face." The earring stayed on the mantel, small, cold, a reminder of the cost of choosing evidence over intimacy. 3 weeks later, morning light filled the dressing room. Eleanora sat at the vanity, brushing her hair with the same long strokes she had used the night she found the earring. The rhythm was meditative, familiar, a small piece of order in a world that had been thoroughly disordered and was only now beginning to settle. Edmund appeared in the doorway. His reflection filled the mirror behind her. The same image as the opening, the same arrangement of glass and light, and 2 people occupying the same space. But everything had changed. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, in the exact spot where the earring had been hidden. "Mrs. Garrick has appointed the new housekeeper," he said. "A Mrs. Chesney from Wiltshire. She has opinions about the linen rotation." "Good," Eleanora said without turning. "I have opinions about the linen rotation." "I know. She will hear them directly. I have instructed that all household matters go through you, not through me, not through Mrs. Garrick's interpretation of what I think you want. You are the Duchess of Ashworth. The household answers to you. That is what should have happened 11 months ago. Yes, I am 11 months late. I intend to make up the time." Eleanora set down the brush and looked at him in the mirror. His face was open, steady, no longer bewildered or frightened. He had learned what it cost to ignore the person telling him something was wrong. She had learned what it cost to investigate instead of asking. They had both paid for their mistakes, and they were both still standing. "Come here," she said. He crossed to stand behind her at the vanity. She took his hand and placed it over hers on the brush handle. His fingers were clumsy, uncertain. He pulled too hard on the first stroke, tugging her hair. "You pull too hard," she said. I will learn. You will practice. The mirror held two faces, hers composed and watchful, his reflected behind her, learning the rhythm of a gesture he had never needed to learn before. The brush moved through her hair in long, careful strokes. On the mantel, the pearl drop earring caught the morning light. Small, cold, irrelevant now. The house around them had changed. Catherine was gone. Mrs. Chesney had arrived with her own ideas about how things should be done and had listened with genuine attention when Eleanora explained what she wanted. The staff had adjusted. The correspondence arrived on time. Mary had been reassigned back to Eleanora's service. But the deepest change was not in the household. It was in the two people standing at the vanity, learning how to brush hair together, learning how to ask questions instead of building cases, learning how to notice when something was wrong instead of assuming everything was fine. The brush moved. The mirror held their faces. The earring stayed on the mantel, a small monument to the cost of their mistakes and the value of what they had nearly lost. Outside, London woke to another morning. Inside Ashworth House, a duchess and a duke stood together in front of a mirror, practicing the ordinary intimacy of shared space, and discovering that love was not the absence of failure, but the willingness to see it, name it, and begin again.